Chapter 3 The Enchanter's Lecture. "Is that everything, Tika?" Bradigen asked in a hushed voice, peeking briefly through an ornate wooden door and into the massive lecture hall beyond. Tika looked down at the stack of notes in her hands, struggling to contain her nervous and excited jitters. She carefully flipped through them, ensuring they were all present and in the correct order. This was the third time she had checked, and she knew everything was in place. But Bradigen, perfectionist that he was, just had to make sure. Finally, Tika finished her final check and nodded in the affirmative.
"Yep, it's all here,"
she stated enthusiastically. "Good," Bradigen said, taking a breath before taking the stack of papers and holding it close to his belly. "Good." Tika examined the old dwarf for a moment, smiling. He had dressed himself up in his nicest clothes for this occasion. A sleek red button-down shirt, with shiny silver buttons and trim along the seams, black slacks, and clean shoes. He'd even taken the time to comb his beard and bound the end of it with a plain black band. All in all, it was a far more refined look than his typical grungy craftsman look. Tika looked down at herself and frowned. Compared to her teacher, she hadn't done much to her appearance. She'd used some polish on her claws and on her beak, sure, and she was well bathed, but that was about it. She had never really cared for how she looked in the past and only ever worried about being comfortable. And that had remained true all the way up until she stepped onto the campus. But now? Oh, well, this was different. This was the Arcaniun Assemblage she was standing in, the absolute pinnacle of scholarly pursuits. History, culture, magic, all of it was studied and archived in the halls of the world's various assemblage chapters. All of the brightest minds across the continent had studied in an assemblage chapter at some point in their careers. In the face of all of that, she was feeling a little underdressed.
"If I'm serious about this enchantress thing, I should probably raise my standards a little bit."
She glanced past Bradigen and through the door at the lecture hall beyond. She could already hear the crowd of curious attendees echoing in the massive space, and a thrill of panic began to creep up her spine. So many people, all expecting nothing but intellectual perfection. So many pairs of eyes, all staring, if not directly at her, then in her general direction. And there was a chance of one very particular pair of eyes hiding out somewhere in that crowd. Bradigen tucked the stack of papers under his arm and refocused his attention on Tika. His brow furrowed, and his lips tightened into a thin line. "You okay, Tika?" Tika nodded far too quickly.
"Yep, I'm fine. Totally fine. I'm absolutely not having a mild panic attack at the idea of going up on stage in the Arcaniun Assemblage lecture hall."
She blurted out before letting out a laugh that could best be described as hysterically unhinged. Bradigen raised an eyebrow. Realizing that was perhaps the most unconvincing way she could have said that, Tika quickly composed herself, cleared her throat, folded her hands behind her back, and put on her sweetest voice.
"I'm fine."
Before Bradigen could give her his customary reassurance, a different voice sliced through the silence of the Backstage office space. "You have nothing to fear, little Tika." Tika spun around, and her eyes flew wide with joy at the sight of Jetta Berkmont strolling into the room. He was also a Kraven, far older than Tika, and dressed in the well-kept green tailcoat jacket of an assemblage archivist. The badge on his chest marked him as a senior stoneholder.
"Jetta!"
Tika greeted, jumping in place. Jetta smiled warmly at her, then turned his attention to Bradigen. "It is almost time. Are your preparations complete?" Bradigen nodded sharply. "Yep. Just gotta get this little bundle of nerves to calm down," he said, clapping Tika on the back. She spun back to him, her cheeks puffing up in indignation.
What the... Brad, come on! I have a right to have a little stage fright.
Jetta stepped up to her, smiling. He reached out to pat her on the head, drawing a pleasant chirp from her. Aye, a right to stage fright, perhaps. But the men and women in that lecture hall are here to be educated. I'll give you a score from 1 to 10 for a circus act, little Tika. You need not stress yourself so. Tika turned back to the older bird and tilted her head.
But this is the assemblage,
she countered.
This is like the place for magic and study and stuff.
Jetta nodded. Yes, it is. We are scholars, but we are not nobles. We're not quite so uptight as the attuners might have the masses think. And if I might let you in on a little secret? Tika, always a fan of secrets, gasped and leaned forward to hear what Jetta had to say. He leaned in to whisper in her ear. We have all had an incident like your doll at some point during our time here, he said, slipping into the Kraven's native language. Tika pulled back, heat rushing up to fill her cheeks at the reminder.
What? But how do you know about that?
She demanded. It only took her a moment for her brain to make the connection, and she spun to the only other person in the room who had any routine contact with Jetta.
Bradigen!
She cawed. Bradigen perked up. Oh, are we talking about me now? Tika ran up to him and pounded her fists ineffectually on Bradigan's shoulders.
You told him about what happened with my doll?
Bradigan raised an eyebrow. Years ago, I did... Did you not know? Tika spluttered at him, then cawed in his face. He leaned back from her breath, chuckling. Behind Tika, Jetta's amused voice piped up. It would appear not.
Traitor! Snitch! Beardo!
Tika raged, continuing to uselessly thump her teacher's shirt. Bradigan pulled back from her before pressing the tip of his finger into her beak, instantly silencing her and ending her tirade. He smirked. Because it was a funny story? He offered. Tika just glared at him.
I hate you,
she mumbled, crossing her arms in a huff. Bradigan's arm flashed out and hauled Tika down to his level. She squawked in alarm, then cried out when his massive knuckles ground into her skull. She struggled mightily to break away from him, to no avail. Love you too, kiddo, he laughed. Tika, squirming in vain, cawed at him. Before the wholesome scene could continue any further, the reverberations of the assemblage's bell tower echoed through the walls, striking 12 times in a slow, steady beat. Bradigan released his hold on Tika, and all eyes turned to the door and the lecture hall beyond. The light on the other side was growing dark. Jetta clacked his beak. It is time, he said before taking a few steps back. Good luck, Bradigan. And thank you for agreeing to do this for us. Bradigan waved the bird off. No problem, but save the thanks till the job's been done, yeah? He asked before hoisting up his notes. You know, just in case this all goes to hell. Jetta smirked. I fail to see how it could. You have the perfect assistant, he said, giving Tika a meaningful glance and wink. Tika looked down, flushing at the praise. With that, Jetta withdrew, leaving Bradigan and Tika alone. The dwarf gave her a pat on the shoulder. All right, let's get to it, shall we? He said. He did not wait for Tika to answer before spinning on his heels and marching for the door. Tika lagged behind for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Then, puffing up her chest, she ran quickly after Bradigen and out into the sprawling lecture hall. To describe the hall as magnificent would be an understatement. An elevated stage made of deep red wood spread out before her, polished to a glistening shine and trimmed at the edges with ornamental designs. To her right, beyond the stage, numerous rows of seats had been arranged in a large amphitheater. A massive circular window was set into the dome-shaped ceiling, affording a view of the sky. The room was dimly lit, bathed in the colors of dusk as short night began, the time when the sun passed behind the ring. To counteract that darkness, ring stones had been set into the walls at regular intervals, each one surrounded by runes. Tika knew these runes well, and her keen eyes could read them even from this distance. Glow as fire when surrounded by darkness. The stones bathed the room in a gently flickering white light. And in that light, she realized with a lump of terror just how many people were staring at her.
Oh, sweet Suna's breath.
The room was absolutely packed. She felt as if she had never seen so many people all clustered together in one place before, and several of them were focusing on her as she came out onto the stage. It was to be expected. As a Kraven in a mostly human city, she was used to receiving stares, just not this many all at once. She quickly resumed her stride to catch up to Bradigen in the center of the stage. He spun to face the crowd as Tika slid to a stop behind him and folded her hands behind her back. She did her level best to ignore how many people were looking. Bradigen smiled and threw his arms wide.
"Hello, people of Underbridge,"
he called out, his voice magically amplified to echo across the chamber by an enchantment on the stage.
"I am Bradigen Gandalford. I am an independent enchanter with over 20 years of experience, and I've been asked by the fine people here at the Arcaniun Assemblage to provide a lecture on the history of my craft for those of you who might be interested in pursuing it yourselves one day, or for those who are just curious to know more about what all these sparkly little rocks do."
Bradigen checked his notes, then folded his arms behind his back and started pacing across the stage.
Now, the art of enchantment has existed for several centuries and is practiced to some extent in nearly all corners of Auris. In the modern day, it is a finely tuned science, and a master enchanter can make just about any mundane item into a tool of magic with not just precision, but also grace. It is as much an art form as it is a science. But this wasn't always the case. When it was first uncovered that Luma could obey written instructions as well as spoken ones, there was a mad scramble to dissect how it worked and push the boundaries of this infantile craft. And, much like any craft, the first steps were, to put it mildly, clunky at the best of times.
Tika only half listened as Bradigen launched into the lecture. She had heard all of this before many times already, so she had no need to pay much attention to what he was saying. Instead, she kept her eyes focused on the crowd, looking for any sign of someone raising their hand. It was her primary job for this lecture to make sure Bradigen addressed any questions that came up. As the minutes ticked by, though, everyone seemed to be satisfied with what they were learning. She saw a handful of confused glances here and there, yes, but they swiftly vanished as Bradigen always moved to add clarification whenever he dropped a complicated term or referred to some obscure bit of trivia or history. As the presentation went on, Tika slowly began to relax. All eyes were on the stage, yes, but not on her. And by the time the lecture had been going for 30 minutes, she'd only been asked to speak a couple of times. usually to offer her insight on what it was like to learn the craft. She was starting to loosen up and really get into the swing of things, and once again cast her eyes eagerly across the assembled masses when Bradigen paused to give people a chance to ask questions. And then she spotted someone in the crowd, and her heart skipped a beat. It was Avaline. Tika's brain stalled, and she all but froze in place like a deer caught in the lantern light of a speeding carriage on a cloudy night. All thoughts ceased to be, save for a high-pitched ringing noise that she was pretty sure didn't contain any actual words. In all of the dread of being on stage, she had totally forgotten that Avaline might have been here. Judging by the tiny smile and quiet, almost inaudible giggle that Avaline released on seeing that reaction, Tika realized that she had been caught staring. She quickly drew herself up, face flushing. She could just thank her lucky stars that her feathers hid her face.
And here we go again. What is wrong with me?
Bradigen came up next to Tika, a brow rising.
What is it?
He whispered, low enough that the stage's enchantment wouldn't pick up his voice.
Oh, it's nothing.
Tika lied before frantically casting her eyes around the crowd again, desperate for an excuse. She spotted one shortly and jetted her beak at a boy who looked to be no older than 15 years old with their hand up.
Just, someone has a question.
Bradigen's brow remained raised, and Tika knew her flimsy excuse hadn't convinced him. Still, he chose not to press the matter for now and merely followed her pointing beak. He smiled and gestured at the boy.
You have a question, lad?
The boy hesitated for a moment and then spoke up, having to raise his voice to be heard on the stage. Yeah. Is it true that it's possible to enchant, well, people? If spotting Avaline had made Tika's heart jump, hearing that question made her stomach turn. She involuntarily clacked her beak at the question, and she could see a ripple of dismay washing through the crowd. Bradigen furrowed his brow, his lips turning into a grim frown.
Aye, it is,
he said slowly.
But it is a forbidden art in most corners of the world, and with good reason.
How come? The boy pressed. If you can enchant someone, doesn't that mean you can make them stronger or faster or something? Bradigen took a breath, and Tika could see his discomfort at the question. He folded his hands behind his back and took to pacing the stage again.
From a purely technical standpoint, yes, you can enhance the physical or even mental capabilities of a living being by enchanting them. But you need to understand that flesh enchantment is a horrific ordeal for them. They have to follow the exact same rules as an inanimate object. Enchanting a living being is no different from enchanting a sword, save that the sword is not alive to feel what is being done to it.
The boy's eyes widened as he grappled with the implication. So you mean... Bradigen nodded.
In enchanting, you must carve runes into the object to be enchanted and fill those runes with dust from a ringstone. It is the same process to enchant a person. The runes must be carved into their very flesh. It is a horrific act of mutilation. And even if it is performed successfully, there are countless ways a flesh enchantment can go wrong once it sets in. You may, for instance, enhance a human body with enough strength to punch through a brick wall. But if you do not also enhance the body's durability to compensate, then that punch will shatter their every bone and turn their organs to paste. For those reasons, flesh enchantment was outlawed here in Emira over 100 years ago. To perform flesh enchantment on another living being is a crime punishable by death in most circles. And those who have been enchanted are strongly encouraged to submit themselves to local law enforcement, or if they have one, an assemblage chapter to have their enchantments safely dispelled. Only in a small handful of cases have exceptions been made.
Bradigen explained before catching himself, his expression darkening as he realized the grim nature of the subject matter. He turned to the boy.
I trust that answers your question, young man?
The boy nodded and slowly slid back into his seat. Bradigen took a deep breath.
Good. Now let's move away from that grim subject matter, shall we? We're here to discuss the wonders of enchantment, not the politics or laws around it.
With that, Bradigen swiftly returned to the primary focus of the lecture. It took a few minutes, but bit by bit, the mood in the chamber returned to what it was before the boy's question. Tika, however, was not so swift to recover her mood. She knew the full history of enchanting, having read all about it even when Bradigen wasn't teaching her himself. All that she had read made the dangers of flesh enchantment perfectly clear to her. The sketches of the victims were not easy memories to shake once they were brought to the forefront. Had she not been distracted by her own dark thoughts, she might have noticed that down in the crowd, Avaline, too, appeared uncomfortable, anxiously rubbing at her bracelet. Close to an hour after the lecture began, it ended. Bradigen went on for quite a while, going over the basics of the enchanting process and smoothing over a handful of misconceptions about the craft. After that, he answered more questions, once again spotted primarily by Tika. It went well, by and large. Assuming, of course, one was willing to discount the fact that Tika was a distracted, stammering mess the entire time, courtesy of Aveline being fantastic at distracting her. Naturally, Tika discounted that as much as she could. Tika let out a heavy sigh of relief as she and Bradigen made their way backstage. She found the nearest wall and promptly collapsed against it, cradling her head in her hands.
Tika, what is wrong?
Bradigen asked, his tone serious.
You were twitchy for the entire lecture, and not your usual kind of twitchy. What's gotten into you?
A girl?
Tika blurted without thinking. There was a pause. Bradigen quirked a brow. Blushing once again, Tika realized how absurd that sentence sounded, and quickly moved to correct herself.
There was a girl I know in the audience. I met her the other day down in Arcade, and, she just surprised me, that's all. I'm fine.
Another unhinged laugh. Bradigen stared at Tika for a few long moments, and Tika realized she may have overcorrected just a little. And then Bradigen smirked. And Tika decided that she did not love today. Bradigen leaned against the wall in front of Tika.
Who is she?
He asked in a strange tone of voice, like he knew something she didn't.
No one,
Tika mumbled, turning back to Bradigen. She pointed her beak squarely at the floor to hide the fact that, once again, for some reason, she was blushing.
Her name is Avaline?
Bradigen hummed and nodded along slowly.
That is a pretty name.
It's really pretty.
Tika agreed in an almost dreamy tone. And then she realized what just happened, and she aggressively slapped herself in the face.
Ah! What is wrong with me?
She exclaimed. Bradigen clapped her on the shoulder, drawing her attention. She looked down at the dwarf, blinking. He smirked up at her.
Nothing's wrong with you, lass, he told her, You're just not used to this, I think, is the issue.
Tika blinked again.
Not used to what?
Bradigen's smile visibly strained. "Ah," he said a moment later. Tika tilted her head the other way and clacked her beak.
What? What are you talking about? Start making sense, Brad!
Bradigen put on a show of thinking over her demand, stroking his beard, humming exaggeratedly. Then he smirked again.
I think not.
Tika cawed at him. He pressed his finger into the tip of her beak in retaliation, earning a huff of irritation from her. It was at around this time that a door across the room swung open, and Jetta came walking in, clapping his hands. "That was excellent, you two. I dare say the populace picked up a thing or two," he said before glancing at Tika. He drew up short and lowered his hands. "Am I interrupting something?" Bradigen shook his head.
Not at all.
He called back before turning to Tika.
Come on, kiddo. Let's wrap up all the formalities with the higher-ups, eh?
She squirmed under his gaze for a few seconds, fidgeting.
Actually, if it's all right with you, can I head out there and go say hi? I kinda told her we'd spend some time together after the presentation if she came.
Bradigen eyed her for a few seconds longer. Again, he had that knowing look. He stroked his beard for a moment, then shrugged, smiling.
All right. The paperwork's all pretty boring anyway, and you're not really gonna have anything to do with all that. You go run along and say hi to your friend.
You mean it?
Tika squealed, realizing how excited she sounded by the prospect and deciding she did not care. However, she did find it weird how Bradigen put so much emphasis on the word friend. Bradigen nodded and ruffled her head feathers with a chuckle.
I mean it. Beat it, you little tyke. Go and have some fun. And good luck.
That gave Tika a moment of pause.
Good luck? What do you mean by that?
Bradigen snickered.
Don't worry about it. Go on. Shoo.
Tika stared at him a moment longer.
He's hiding something,
she thought. She narrowed her eyes at Bradigen and clacked her beak a few times. Then, with a roll of her eyes, she shot forward to give the man a swift hug, and then ran out the door as fast as her avian legs could carry her. The crowds had mostly dispersed by now. Tika came scrambling out onto the stage and into the rows of seats. She scanned the few remaining faces for any sign of Avaline, her heart pounding out an impressive drumbeat, just like last time. There wasn't any sign of Avaline to be had here, however, and so with a huff, Tika ruffled her feathers and took off at a full run for the exit. She took a few turns through the corridors, deftly dodging students going about their day, and then came out into the light of day. The last shades of short night were fading as the sun came out from behind the pale ring. Tika paused briefly, looking back and forth across the massive courtyard that spread out before her. The campus of the Arcaniun Assemblage was massive, and this courtyard was but one of several. A magnificent fountain statue had been erected in the middle of the plaza, upon which numerous paved pathways converged. Lush grass dotted with trees and artistically placed bushes gave an air of naturality to the vista. Tika could easily imagine young students spending their breaks under the shade of trees. Surrounding the entire campus was a dark brick wall 15 feet high, topped with coiling black iron spikes that discouraged would-be intruders from climbing into the campus. There were a lot of people here, but no sign of Avaline.
Crap.
Tika whispered to herself, frantically looking this way and that.
Where is she?
But she couldn't see any sign of the human. It was just strangers, some of whom were looking at her in surprise and confusion. She had been up on stage the entire time. None of them would have any reason to expect her to be among them now. She looked around a few moments longer. She was getting ready to resign herself to the idea that she would never find Avaline amidst all of this. But then, as fate would have it, a familiar sound caught her ear. The whistling. Tika immediately latched onto the sound like a bloodhound tracking a snack. It was coming from the other side of the large, elegantly decorated gates in the wall. They stood open today, with a couple of green-robed guards standing beside it. The visitors for the lecture were shuffling out of the campus, their time here over. Tika took a deep breath, drew herself up, and took off at a sprint. She ducked and weaved through the shifting mass of people, offering a few apologies as she went. On the other side of the gate, the road sloped down into the heart of Underbridge, framed on either side by long lines of well-kept, multi-story homes. Up ahead, walking down the road at a slow pace, hands folded behind her back, was Avaline, whistling her little tune to herself. Tika beamed.
There you are.
She took in a breath and called out a greeting in her native tongue. The whistling chirrups of a songbird echoed down the street, and Avaline drew to a stop. She spun around to face Tika, the last remnants of a disappointed frown being replaced with a look of wide-eyed surprise. Tika waved.
Hiya, Avaline!
She called, reverting to the common tongue before catching up to the girl in a jog. Avaline blinked, surprised, but walked forward to meet Tika partway.
Tika? What are you doing out here?
She asked once Tika was in earshot.
Coming to see you, silly.
Tika replied as she skidded to a stop.
Whew. I'm glad you made it. I'm not gonna lie, I was worried you weren't gonna come. It's not exactly a short walk from Archshade. What are you doing walking away?
Avaline looked down and to one side, blushing slightly and with no feathers to hide it.
Well, I saw you going back behind the stage when the lecture was over and we were asked to leave. I thought maybe you forgot, or that you didn't want to see me after all. Oh,
Tika said, frowning. She hadn't taken the keepers of the campus into consideration.
yeah, sorry about them. The assemblage is really picky about who they let on campus. I should have warned you. I'm sorry.
Avaline shook her head.
No, it's fine.
She said, smiling. Relieved, Tika leaned forward.
So, what did you think of the lesson?
She asked hopefully.
Bradigen spent a long time working on this, and so did I. It was interesting.
Avaline replied, idly rubbing at her left shoulder.
Although...
There was a pause. Tika tilted her head.
Although... what?
She questioned.
Did Bradigen get too technical? He does that sometimes.
Avaline shook her head.
No, nothing like that. I understood everything he said.
She assured. She offered Tika a glance.
I have you to thank for that, actually.
Tika blinked.
What? Really? Yes. The last time we met, you told me all about what you do as an enchantress.
Avaline explained with a charmed smile.
And I like to think I'm a good listener.
Tika snapped her fingers.
Right! That!
She exclaimed. There was a moment of quiet. Avaline turned around to look out at Underbridge, and Tika noted a slight shift in her body language. She withdrew into herself, tensing up and shrinking, as if she were under the imposing glare of a murderous dragon. Sensing what was probably going through her head, Tika stepped up beside her and looked out at the town as well.
First time on the arch?
She questioned in a quiet voice.
No. I've been here before.
Avaline replied, her hand lowering from her arm to toy with her bracelet.
My father brought me up here about 10 years ago. It's been a long time. I'd forgotten what it's like. It's so overwhelming.
Tika ventured, recalling how tiny and frightened she had felt the first time she had arrived in Underbridge all those years ago.
And bright,
Avaline added, looking up at the sky. She shielded her eyes with her hand.
I'm not used to getting so much sunlight at once. Down in Archshade, the brightest time of day is when the sun is rising and setting. It shines right through. But up here...
Tika nodded along, then turned to Avaline.
Well, I did say I'd show you around. And I've lived up here a long time. I know where all the best spots are. The best places to eat, the best holes to hide in, all the best street corners to meet dogs so you can pet them.
Before Avaline could offer an answer, the growl of a ferocious beast filled the air. Tika went rigid, her eyes slowly lowering to the source of the noise. Avaline's stomach. The human turned a bright shade of red. She put a hand to her belly.
I think I'd like to be shown where to eat, yes.
She agreed with a sheepish chuckle. Tika squealed. Without even thinking about it, she reached out and took hold of one of Avaline's hands in both of her own. She momentarily marveled at how soft they felt in spite of the calluses that covered them.
Yay! All right, come on. There's this wonderful little bakery on a corner that sells just the best pastries. Their bread is all warm and crunchy, but soft and fluffy on the inside. And if you ask, they can put sugar on it. And they have muffins, too. Muffins, Avaline!
Avaline stumbled after Tika, taken off guard by the sudden movement. She laughed and lightly pulled her hand out of Tika's grasp.
Okay, relax, Tika. No need to pull. Sorry, excited. Muffins!
Tika chirped. Avaline rubbed at her wrist and gave Tika an anticipatory look.
You know, I've never had a muffin before. Are they any good?
She asked. It was like a thunderbolt went off in Tika's brain. She ground to a halt, the rest of the world becoming utterly insignificant. She slowly turned to Avaline.
You've never had a muffin?
She asked, horrified. Avaline blinked.
No?
Tika took her hand again.
We're going to get you a muffin!
Avaline didn't even have the chance to protest before she was once again pulled down the street. This time, she wisely did not resist.